Bonjour à tous. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Pavillon du Canada à la COP 15 et merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Corey Toth, je suis conseiller de programmation du Pavillon du Canada. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Canada Pavilion at COP 15 and thank you for joining us today. My name is Corey Toth. I'm a program advisor for the Canada Pavilion. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our next event, the Global Treasure, Boreal Forests, Peat Bogs, and Oceans, hosted by Wildlands League. C'est avec plaisir que vous présentez notre prochain événement, le Trésor mondial, forêt boréale, tourbière et océan, organisé par Wildlands League. This panel will be moderated by Janet Sumner. Janet is the Executive Director for the Wildlands League, the former co-chair of the National Advisory Panel on Nature, and the former Minister's Special Representative on Nature. Janet is currently the chair for the Minister's Advisory Panel on the Rouge National Urban Park. Please join me in welcoming Janet.
I have to do the double switch. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you, Canada, for hosting this great pavilion. It's really beautiful, and we're very pleased to be here. I'm going to start with land acknowledgement, and please forgive my pronunciation because I'm used to doing the one in Toronto. So the land that the COP15 is being held on is the traditional territory of the Kanagahaga. I hope I got that close. The Kanagahaga are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and this island is known as the Gyojage, and again, pardon my pronunciation, in the language of the Kanagahaga, and has historically served as a meeting place for the other Indigenous nations. But it's not enough for us just to acknowledge the land and the keepers of this land from time immemorial, but it's also important that we take action for reconciliation to occur. So it's not just important to accept and hear the truth, but also take action. I'm now going to introduce our speakers before we move on. And we have the great pleasure of being able to hear from Dr. Lorna Harris, who's going to give us a very good view of what carbon is at stake in the peatlands. And one of the things that you'll learn today is just how important this area is, and how important not just in terms of biodiversity, but also, and obviously important to the people who live here in terms of the Indigenous nations, but very important for climate change. And it's the reason that the two conferences need to be brought together, because we see a disconnect when we look at how we count carbon and how we treat carbon reserves in the unmanaged, which is we're going to focus on today. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Harris with us, and she's going to have to literally dash and run to another event where she's doing a second presentation. So we're going to have her go up first. And we also have Vern Chichu, and Vern is going to be speaking. He's from Mushkegowuk Council, and he'll be speaking to the projects that we have underway, or that they have underway there, both on terrestrial and marine, my understanding is. We have Anna Baggio, who is the Director of Conservation for Wildlands League, and she'll be speaking to the Ring of Fire, and that is a proposed mining development in the peatlands. And Marshall Johnson from the National Audubon Society, we have here. He's arrived late last night or early this morning, depending on, on how you look at it, but he's just assured us that he doesn't need to sleep, so that's good news. And he'll be here discussing birds with Dr. Carrie Gray, also from the National Audubon Society. And we have, last but never least, Sam Hunter, who's a councilman from Weenus First Nation, but he's also a great guy to go and travel on the land with. We've taken many trips with Sam, and he is doing phenomenal work in his community and taking the message further abroad on why we need to do conservation in the north and how important it is. And he's also really good at managing polar bears, in case you see one today. So. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Lorna. I think you're first up, correct? Okay. Sorry, what? Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Anna, you're right. We have a video to start the session. Please forgive me.
This area, it's like the Serengeti of Ontario, maybe Canada. The peatlands, all the river systems, all the creeks, all the bogs, it's all connected with the bay. It's like a giant lung, just like your lungs. it gives you life. That's what it is. It's a cycle. It's really important not only for our community, but the whole planet.
This is what they talk about it as, being breathing lands. To us, it's part of that living and breathing part of the earth. The other part to this land here is we call it the shoreline, the birthing place, because of the birds. Those two are very much connected and need to be protected together, not just one.
In Ontario's far north lies one of the most unique ecosystems on Earth, where the Arctic and boreal forest merge into one. A vast forest of blue, of interconnected rivers and wetlands that drain into one of the world's biggest inland seas, Hudson Bay. Together, this system represents one of the largest storehouses of carbon on the planet. The Muskego Cree have been sustained by these lands and waters for thousands of years, and recently began working with the Canadian government to create a national marine conservation area that would cover the entire Ontario coastline of Hudson and James Bay. This historic proposal would be a game changer for protecting many threatened and endangered species and sustaining the way of life for the Muskego Cree for future generations. In the summer of 2022, we joined up with the Wildlands League and the Winnisk First Nation on a mission to film Ontario's rarely seen beluga whales to help show Canadians why the coast of Hudson and James Bay are so deserving of official protection.
So Wildlands League is a conservation charity. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary not too long ago. We've been around for a long time. We protect watersheds, we want to protect the habitat of endangered species, we want to make forestry better, we want to improve the way mining's done. We're trying to secure a safe climate, and that means looking at the natural carbon solutions. Major rivers in Ontario, Albany, Attawapiskat, Ekwan, Winnisk, Sutton, Severn, Moose, they all drain into James Bay and Hudson Bay. And for the longest time, we've come to this region from a land perspective first. So we would spend a lot of time here. It would be about the fresh water, the rivers, the trees, the peatlands, the wetlands. But whenever we would speak with our Indigenous partners, they would never see a distinction with the bay. It was all one to them. It was all connected. So now they've moved forward on creating something called the National Marine Conservation Area. It's going to be a huge area. The study area alone is 90,000 square kilometers, bigger than a small European country. And all these rivers lead into the bay, and that system is one.
These rivers, these great rivers that are emptying the Hudson Bay, James Bay lowlands, and they pour out into James Bay and into Hudson Bay, are they carrying carbon? Is it dissolved organic carbon that's going into the bay? What's happening to it? How is it moving? We don't understand that in any kind of rigorous way. So we've been working with the Muskego people who want to create a national marine conservation area here and work with Canada, and Canada's launched a feasibility study for that here. And part of that needs to be understanding how carbon moves land to sea.
Our destination was the mouth of the Winnisk River, where local First Nations had told us is a key summer feeding area for belugas. But getting to such a remote corner of the province isn't easy. After a 13-hour drive to the town of Nikina, we boarded a small plane that would take us to our next stop, Peatlands, home of the Winnisk First Nation.
So we arrived here in Peatlands on the shores of the Winnisk River, and tonight we're going to meet the community, and then tomorrow, even further north, to Hudson's Bay.
Here we go.
After meeting with the community to share our goals for the trip and its connection to the marine conservation area, it was time to load up the freighter canoes and head for the coast. But as soon as we headed downriver, it was clear that the banks of the Winnisk looked much different than rivers we are used to seeing further south. Melting permafrost was causing the banks of the river to collapse, taking chunks of the forest with it.
In my lifetime, the changes that I've seen is the melting permafrost. It's melting at an alarming rate, and some places it's drying up. It's turning into muskeg because the permafrost melting into the sinks, and a lot of trees are dying. And the river here, it's collecting a lot of sediment, and it's really shallow to drive. There's also a lot of methane released to the atmosphere, and that can cause the climate to warm faster.
After 2 hours on the river, we arrived at the coast and set up camp.
So it's the morning of day 2, and today we woke up to one of the most incredible sights we've ever seen. There were hundreds of caribou in pretty much every direction. There's 2 big herds, and we were filming them for well over an hour, and then they came together and formed one massive herd, well over 1,000 altogether. Too many to count, really.
We used to have herds in the hundreds of thousands, but they're going further and further north because of the melting permafrost. When I was a kid, I saw herds like this, and this is the first time I've seen them again, maybe 40 years later. And it's nice to see, especially just to take pictures and enjoy them walking around. So I haven't seen that in a long time, and it was a blessing.
We could have spent all day filming caribou, but it was time to get back on the water and find beluga whales.
So we made it to the open water, and we've just spotted our first belugas. Sam, you like our chances?
What's that?
You like our chances?
I think so.
All right.
But they're in the deep water, and once they clean the motors, they're gonna look a bat out of hell.
We just spotted some belugas off our bow around 11 o'clock.
I think one of the important things that we need in this planet is to take care of the planet that takes care of us. The Hudson Bay Lowland gives us clean air, cleans our pollution, and we need to take care of it.
When communities are telling us they want to protect areas, we need to start listening to that. And there are many, many communities across Canada who are saying that they want to see areas protected, because these areas are frankly going to be helping us weather the oncoming changes that climate change are going to bring to us. And so keeping this carbon here helps buffer against the impacts of climate change.
We are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis in addition to a climate crisis, so we need to start protecting some of these areas at a much faster pace and at a much larger scale. And so leading and listening from Indigenous peoples is going to get us a long way if we just started to do that more. And getting more ambition. I mean, right now, so many of our provinces and territories don't have the ambition needed to get to, say, 25% protection by 2025 or 30 by 30. They're still stuck at 10%. So certainly doing more protected areas, increasing our ambition and working faster on a bigger scale, that's what we need to do.
I believe what we do here, what we're trying to protect here, has a strong, significant value to the rest of the world at large.
As you can see, I have a really bad day job. That was a trip we got to do this summer with Sam and the Water Brothers, and the Water Brothers did a tremendous job putting that film together. They're going to have it come out. They'll have, I think, a special episode on Ontario and wetlands and water happening in March, I believe, on TVO. So if you get a chance, you'll get to see much more of that footage. And we were very pleased to have them allow us to show the film here. So, Dr. Harris, please tell us about carbon in the peatlands.
Oh, it's on. Okay, thank you. I have a few slides. Are they going to be coming right behind me? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about those peatlands that you saw in that amazing video footage. Next. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, there's a photograph of the peatlands of the Hudson Bay Lowland, but the video footage really showed the extent of this landscape, these peatlands, a lot better, I think. So I'm going to get straight into it. Talking about peatlands here at COP15 in Canada is very important. Canada has 1/4 of the world's peatlands. So if we're going to talk about meeting 30% protection of land and waters by 2030, we do have to talk about peatlands. So you can see here the map. I'm just going to stand up because this will be easier for me to see. You can see the peatland cover across Canada. And you can see here the outline of the Hudson Bay Lowland. I mean, it stands out on the global map, but it really also stands out just across Canada. There's massive peatland area. It's an area that's bigger than Germany, and it is just one big peatland complex. So it's a vast, intact peatland complex, bogs, fens, swamps, as far as the eye can see. It's also the homeland of Indigenous peoples, and Sam and Vern will be talking a lot more about that. Why is it important for carbon? We've heard that just mentioned before. The Hudson Bay Lowland, it's the second largest peatland complex in the world after the West Siberian lowlands in Russia. It stores 30 to 35 billion tons of carbon, and it is also actively taking carbon from the atmosphere. So it's sequestering approximately 10 to 14 million tons of carbon per year. It's a very rough estimate, just because this very remote region just doesn't have a lot of data for carbon, particularly for fluxes of carbon. So why are peatlands special compared to the forests across Canada? So the power of the peatlands is their ability to capture carbon and store it for a very, very long time. So they will store carbon for thousands of years. So a lot of the carbon, you might be 2 meters down into a peat core, and that carbon could be 4,000 years old. That could be part of a plant that took carbon from the atmosphere 4,000 years ago. And across Canada and the Northern Hemisphere in general, peatlands will store carbon for around 10,000 years, just because of the end of glaciation. The Hudson Bay Lowland, it is a younger peatland landscape, so some of those peatlands are around 7,000 years old. So what is peat? Just taking a very, very quick step back. It is a dark organic soil. It's essentially dead plants. This plant you can see here is sphagnum moss. Most of the peatlands in the Hudson Bay Lowland are formed of this little tiny moss, which is then basically very slowly decomposing and building up these peat soils. So peatlands, you might often hear them called bogs, fens, swamps. In Canada, you will often hear them called muskeg. This is just what they look like on the ground. But they are threatened, and you probably heard a lot about the Ring of Fire mining development, which is proposed for this region. So there are currently around 5,000 square kilometers of mining claims in the region, and a very rough estimate of the carbon with the peatlands where those mining claims are is around 450 million tons of carbon. Converted to CO2, it's about 1.6 billion tons of CO2. So this is just what's at stake. So then I've been asked questions, well, what if only 10% of this region was developed? What if it was only 500 square kilometers? So not all of the mining claims went ahead. That's 45 million tons of carbon, 165 million tons of carbon dioxide. It's just because of the way the carbon is packed in the peatlands, it's incredibly dense. And these peatlands, where the Ring of Fire mining claims are, happen to be the oldest and deepest peatlands in the Hudson Bay Lowland. So it's just a fact of peatlands. They store a lot of carbon, and so developing in this region needs to take care of that, needs to be aware of it, and needs to take a lot of care of that situation, because if we don't, then we put our climate targets at risk. So what happens to peatlands when they're affected by mining? Very quickly going to show you some examples. These are drained peatlands in the Hudson Bay Lowland as well, near a diamond mine. They basically lose their moss cover and they dry up on the surface, and they are sources of carbon to the atmosphere. So you can see the photographs here. These bare peat areas that you can see, these should be pools of water with sphagnum in them, but they're not. They're bare peat. These drained peatlands, damaged peatlands, are also much more vulnerable to wildfire. So wildfire is a very big risk for peatlands in Canada, particularly in drier areas such as Western Canada. But even in places like the Hudson Bay Lowland, if you drain a peatland, it is more vulnerable to fire. And then carbon dioxide emissions from these burnt peatlands can be very, very large. And they can continue for many years, smoldering over the winter many years before they recover. Fire also increases permafrost thaw. You saw some of the permafrost thaw examples in the video footage there. Fire on the surface, that can increase permafrost thaw. So you get a knock-on effect of that development. And all of these things interact. There are cumulative effects. Drained peatlands, damaged peatlands, they take decades or more to recover. These are systems that take a very long time to develop, thousands and thousands of years. So it takes decades to get even back to something that will take up carbon again. But most of the peak carbon that's lost from a development is actually irrecoverable. We can't get that back within our lifetimes. So you can see here, this is a photograph of a well pad in Alberta. But I saw recently some photographs from Anna of exploration activities in the Ring of Fire area, and it looked kind of like this without the fire. So even exploration activities can cause a lot of damage to peatlands, and that's something we have to also be very mindful of. So it's not just the mining footprint that is going to impact peatlands, which you can see here, the pit, the peatlands are removed from that surface. That's not the only thing that's impacting these landscapes. There's effects all around them, from the exploration phase through the operational phase. And then it is very, very difficult to recreate a peatland. It's almost impossible. So we never quite get back what was lost. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. As you can see, this is really a good example of how the Climate COP and the Biodiversity COP should come together, because this is unmanaged area in Canada. So we don't count exploration in this area. We only count the carbon when there's a land use change, when it turns into a full mine. So all of the exploration and drilling that's going on right now is not counted in Canada's carbon accounting system. That's a very good example of why we need to be bringing those two COPs together. And now we're going to move to Vern, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the marine and the terrestrial work that Mushkegowik are doing. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Lorna. No, I don't need that, but I'm happy to be here as well to talk about this region that we live in, where we come from, and who we are. You know, we are the land, we are the environment, we are the fish, we are the animals, we are all of that because we're part of it. We're not superior to it. And so this is what our ancestors, you know, have told us year after year. And our elders, when they started traveling in the late 60s and 70s to start talking about the land and the environment and what was happening and their concerns, to bring it back to our people in our regions, and the spiritual connection that we have with the land, you know, over the years has been, you know, there's been attempts made to sever those ties between us and the land, but you know, we've survived. Our people still go on the land. They use the land to survive and hunt and whatnot, and so that we maintain that connection when we think about the environment and what's happening today, and the potential development that's happening west of us, and the potential impacts that could happen there. And so, you know, our people have said, you know, all along that we want this region protected. We want our livelihoods protected. The environment is a top priority. And we have countless resolutions over the years at our annual General Assemblies to do that. And in August 2021, we reached a milestone of an MOU that we signed between Parks Canada and Mushkegowuk to begin the feasibility study on creation of a national marine conservation along the coast of the western Hudson and James Bay. As you saw the map earlier of the region in the video that we've been working to bring attention to, but also the marine region is just part of the puzzle, as we say. It's just part of an ecosystem that's even larger, that connects the watersheds that feed the wetlands, and the wetlands feed the rivers, and the rivers feed the bay. And it provides many habitats all across this ecosystem. And it's a large area, as I think Janet mentioned, or Anna in the video. We're looking at about 91,000 square kilometers of water. But on the terrestrial side, we're also looking at about 133,000 square kilometers of wetlands and boreal forest, in which where the carbon and storage is within this region, and known, as Lorna had mentioned, the second largest carbon sink in the world. And so over the years, with those resolutions and the guidance that we got from the people, wanting the environment to be a top priority for us, that we're pursuing these kinds of things and wanting to bring attention to this region. And the NMCA MOU is the first step. And more recently, there was an announcement made by the Prime Minister last week, or was it this week? Can't remember. Yeah, but the commitment to support conservation planning across Canada. There's 4 areas that are being targeted for funding, and an announcement was made to support these projects to the tune of $800 million, which is big for us because we're the newest what is called a PFP project in Canada. There in the world there's 6 sites, and PFP simply means project financing for permanence. So sites that are being looked at globally for permanent protection. And then permanent protection, what does that mean? How does that impact on the people? And there's got to be an investment in how people are supported. If we're going to protect something forever, then what is the loss? What is the loss to the people economically? How can we create a conservation economy? There's those kinds of things that we will be looking at from this big announcement that was made. And we've in our pursuance of conservation and protection of this region, we called for global attention. And this announcement and our acceptance from the Enduring Earth organization, which is an international organization that accepted our application to be a PFP in Canada, in October 14th, when we got that acceptance letter, that gave us that international attention globally. We're part of a global network of areas for conservation planning. So we're quite happy with that, and but that's just the beginning, and the work has to happen now, and we have to get back into the communities, do the science that we need to do, collect the traditional knowledge and so forth, as we are doing with the NMCA. That's been ongoing now for about just over a year. since we started with the feasibility study, and we forecast probably completing this by 2025, the NMCA. And then, you know, we'll look at whether this is feasible. You know, it'll be decided between the chiefs and Parks Canada in partnership to decide whether this is feasible to protect. But I can assure you that it's a feasible area to be protected, you know, for what it is and what it does. So I'll leave it at that. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Vern. And I'm just going to actually fill in a little bit more on that announcement. It was, I think there was $200 million put up by international funders, plus the $800 million from the Government of Canada announced by the Prime Minister, which puts $1 billion into doing conservation across 4 very large areas across Canada. And one of the great things about that is if you start to do the math right, as we very did in our shop, was I think for one mine, a community might expect to see $2 million a year kind of thing. I mean, that's not necessarily every single mine, but all of a sudden conservation is an economic driver, and it's an economic choice as opposed to the only choice being mining. So this is could be a game changer for this region, but also for Indigenous people in terms of how they think about their land and actually not having to make that sort of devil's choice where you can only choose mining if you want to have an economic future. So we're now going to play a video about the marine piece.
We have to speak for the environment because the environment can't speak for itself.
This MOU is a vehicle to study and assess the conditions of the waters of the bays.
We look forward to a more promising future for ourselves, the elders that are still here with us, but also to our children. We want them to have a better experience. We want them to have a better life.
We have a very long path to travel on reconciliation in this country. But every day we dip our paddle in the water, we begin to close the distance. We must work to transform historic relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And we must similarly strive to transform our relationship with the natural world to a nature-positive, carbon-neutral future.
We have received numerous letters of support across the country from regular Joes, congratulating Mushkego Cree nations on their endeavor to protect their homelands and waters.
Grand Chief Jonathan, Minister Jonathan, with the Jonathans in the room, please stand up. Again, it's really important to document this moment.
As we forge forward on this very important work, let us not look at ourselves, but rather let's consider and think about our children and grandchildren and their children. It is our responsibility to safeguard, protect their culture, our culture, tradition, and livelihood.
Now, here we go. So next we're going to hear from Marshall Johnson, Chief Conservation Officer for the National Audubon Society, and also Dr. Carrie Gray, Boreal Conservation Specialist. We're very pleased to have them all the way from the U.S. to present here at our event. Thank you.
We should change that to the International Audubon Society, right? Yeah. As Janet mentioned, my name is Marshall Johnson. I serve as the Chief Conservation Officer for the National Audubon Society. And Audubon is a collection of 600 community and campus chapters throughout the hemisphere, over 1,500 staff members, biologists, educators, land conservationists throughout the hemisphere working towards and have been working towards the preservation of birds for nearly 120 years. And so to be here speaking with you in conversation in community about birds and the boreal, which is really North America's bird nursery, is truly an honor for me. As was mentioned, I got in really early or late, depending on how you want to talk about it. But nearly 3 a.m. this morning, I put my head to bed, and I was up again at 7. But I'm so glad I was, because not only did I get to have dinner and break bread with the staff members, part of our Boreal Songbird project, but I got to start the morning just adjacent to the St. Lawrence at the Indigenous Leadership Initiative Pavilion. And when you're thinking about daunting issues like biodiversity collapse, bird populations collapse, we lost more than 3 billion birds since just 1970. These can be truly daunting issues, climate change, water pollution, et cetera, et cetera. But to open the morning at the Indigenous Leadership Pavilion and to see and experience and hear true courage, to see the momentum that is being had here is truly inspirational, and I wouldn't have missed it for 3 or 4 more hours of sleep. Audubon is a conservation organization that works across the Americas using science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation to drive the preservation of birds. We like to say birds tell us. I think it was Dr. Thomas Lovejoy said that if you solve for birds, you solve more than 90% of the world's environmental problems, and I think that's true. Birds truly tell us. We focus our efforts on what birds tell us about the health of the environment, including which habitats are in most need of protection and restoration to keep people, birds, and the entire ecosystem healthy. Just as leaders from around the world are gathered here and doing what we hope they're doing, Audubon recognizes that the biodiversity crisis we are facing needs much more ambitious goals. We've heard that today. We're doing such great work. There's so many inspirational partnerships happening across cultures, but we have to kick it into overdrive, and we know that and we recognize that. And I hope, to Janet's point, the biodiversity and climate conversations can be won. I think that's really important moving forward. We as an NGO have come to realize that we must bring solutions to the table that are more ambitious, more hard-charging, and more far-reaching at this critical moment in time. Bringing birds and biodiversity back means that we must work across the entire flyway, everywhere where birds migrate, from the far north here in Canada and far northern, to Chile and Argentina, and just about everywhere beyond and everywhere in between, where birds need us and tell us that they need. That is why Audubon is excited to learn from and be allies with the Mushkegowuk Council and other partners as they lead amazing initiatives, as you've heard from Vern, for this awe-inspiring place we have been hearing about all afternoon, and I hope we hear about all week. To go into more details about what we're doing in partnership here, I want to bring up Dr. Carrie Gray, who will tell you more about the incredible birds and the global significant Hudson and James Bay Lowlands and Coast.
Hello. All right. So each spring, millions of migratory birds travel across the hemisphere to rear their young and take advantage of the bounty of resources in Hudson and James Bay and the adjacent lowlands. That mosaic of wetlands, waterways, forests, and marine waters that weave across this vast landscape provide essential habitat for hundreds of bird species over the course of the year. And these wetlands, when you look at Quebec, Manitoba, and Ontario, extend for an astounding 324,000 square kilometers of pristine, unbroken wilderness. And it's really a sight to behold. I spent some time there this summer banding Canada geese, and we traveled to our banding sites via helicopter, and having this eagle-eye view of this landscape was really awe-inducing. But coming from the very densely populated northeastern United States, I have to say it was a little heartbreaking too. As I looked out at this unending wilderness, forest, wetlands, and ocean extending as far as the eye could see in every direction, I couldn't help but think of how other parts of the world were once wild like this, but are no longer. And once you see that stark contrast between wild places and urban sprawl, you realize it's no wonder that modern extinction rates are 1,000 to 10,000 times greater than natural extinction rates. And as Marshall said, a recent study found that we've, in the course of my lifetime, have lost 3 billion, there are 3 billion fewer birds in Canada and the United States than there were half a century ago. That's a 29% overall decline across 500 species. That's 1/3 of our birds are gone. And that same study, they studied weather radar data that measures the mass of migrating birds, and found that there was a 14% decline just in the last 10 years. So half of that it's happening at a very fast pace, and it's happening faster and faster. But when we protect and restore the places that birds need to thrive, we find that birds are incredibly resilient creatures with an astounding capacity for rebounding. One of the most rapidly declining songbird species in North America is the rusty blackbird, which loss of wetland habitat and environmental contamination has contributed to a 90% decline in the species over the last 50 years. But the wetlands of the Hudson Bay Lowlands are a stronghold for this species. You know, these marshes, lakes, ponds, waterways, swamp forests, they're teeming with insects, fish, and plant foods that birds need to raise their young. And so it's prime breeding habit for the rusty blackbird, but so many other wetland-dependent species. The region also plays an important role during the migratory period, and the extensive coastal marshes, wide tidal flats, and eelgrass beds of Hudson and James Bay make it one of the most important stopover and staging areas for migratory birds in North America. And at least 35 species of waterfowl rely on this region during the migratory season. That's 80% of the waterfowl species that occur in North America. It also provides a safe haven for them during their flightless molt period, where they simultaneously lose all of their flight feathers. And it's a 3 to 4 week flightless period. And so you really need a place that has all your resources in one place. And birds migrate from their breeding grounds to Hudson and James Bay to undergo this process. And you have incredibly large concentrations of birds in one place like that. Migration ecologists term this a geographic bottleneck. It's when you have large concentrations that are in isolation from other locations within the migration corridor. And you have a risk for high population level effects when conditions deteriorate in these places because you have such a large concentration of birds. And we have to look no further than the plight of the red knot to understand the implications of what happens when these types of places deteriorate. The red knot is a shorebird that breeds across the high Arctic. It winters as far south as Chile, and it flies more than 9,000 miles every spring. And for those that migrate along the East Coast, they rely on one place for stopover, that's Delaware Bay, and that timing of that stopover basically coincides with the spawning season of the horseshoe crab. And so the red knots, they fly from South America, land in Delaware Bay, and they feast on these horseshoe crabs until they're fat enough to fly to the Arctic and immediately begin breeding. But in the late 80s, they started harvesting horseshoe crabs for eel and conch bait. And the horseshoe numbers crashed, the horseshoe crab numbers crashed, and the red knot numbers plummeted 90% over a 10-year period. That's how important that one site was for red knots. And that's how important James Bay and Hudson Bay are also for red knots in the fall. They often will be there staging and then fly 5,000 kilometers from there to their next site. So Hudson and James Bay, in fact, is actually a major migration route for 25 shorebird species and has been proposed by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network as a site of hemispheric importance. So the migration routes that birds use do not happen by chance. They have evolved over tens of thousands of years to be the most efficient routes possible, while also optimizing a bird's chance of survival and reproductive capacity. So this makes managing migratory animals complex because they rely on multiple habitats throughout the year. And for migratory birds, this often means crossing multiple jurisdictions, provinces, states, countries, continents, even hemispheres. But Canada can be a leader in protecting healthy bird populations across the hemisphere by safeguarding Hudson Bay and James Bay and including it in the nation's conservation commitment of protecting 30% of their lands and waters. And I'll just end by saying, since I joined Audubon's boreal program last year, I've listened to Indigenous leaders all across Canada calling for protection of their traditional territories. And one of the common threads I hear, whether it's in the West, the East, the South, the North, among those many voices is the need to protect the land for their future generations. So the world needs Indigenous leadership with that kind of forward thinking, because most of the world is thinking about right now, not the future. And we need their wisdom to guide us through the times ahead. So I thank Wildlands League and everyone here for listening today. Thank you.
And its southern extension of James Bay is home to one of the most unique and significant marine ecosystems in the world. At least 133 species of swimming birds, shorebirds, and raptors frequent the offshore, inshore, intertidal, and salt marsh habitats of the Hudson Bay. It also provides vitally important feeding, staging, and molting habitats for migrant birds. This includes tens of thousands of black scoters. During their flight, feather molt each fall. They are unable to fly for up to 40 days. The bay supports them during this vulnerable period. The American golden plover breeds in the Hudson Bay after flying all the way from southern South America. They can travel at amazing speeds, up to 128 kilometers per hour during their migration. Red knots use the Hudson and James Bays as a major stopover point during their migration, including at least 1/3 of the threatened Rufus subspecies. One red knot is known to have flown 5,100 kilometers nonstop for 8 days between Hudson Bay and the Caribbean. There's still more amazing facts to learn about these migrating birds, but we know that when the Hudson and James Bays stay healthy, it means these amazing migrants can complete their journeys every year, from the north of Canada to the south of South America, and to backyards and communities in between. Learn more at audubon.org/boreal.
Thanks very much, Carrie and Marshall. Really pleased to have Audubon here with us today. And I'll just maybe speak to one of the first times I really learned about how Mushkegowuk thinks in a global context. There was an oil spill in the Gulf, and the former Grand Chief, Stan Ludet, explained to me that he was writing to the president to clean up their act because it was poisoning their food source. So the Mushkegowuk really understand the global nature and hemispheric nature of why we need to protect birds, and we certainly need to not only be protecting the boreal and the Mushkegowuk lands, but all those stopover places because they have an impact. You have to protect all of it. Okay, and next we're going to Anna. I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about some Ring of Fire thing.
Yes. Lucky me. I'm just going to pull up a map we printed just recently I might need your assistance, Claire. I have too many things in my hands here. We often produce maps of Northern Ontario to show the industrial activities happening in watersheds. And so you can see some of the major watersheds in Northern Ontario, some of that I mentioned in the film, the Ekwan, the Attawapiskat, the Albany, the Moose, the Winisk. And we do that to kind of show people what the industrial activities are, because they may not be, while individual nations may know what's going on in their backyards, when you start to look at a watershed scale, then it's the picture becomes a little bit more illuminating. And the Ring of Fire here is those claims that Lorna mentioned. There's about 500,000 hectares of mining claims right now here. This is quite a peak number. And you can see it's bisecting the Attawapiskat River. It's got into the Ekwan. It will be impacting the Winisk. And a road, should a road be built, the industry road, would cross the Albany and other watersheds. And communities are downstream of all of this, and they will be impacted, or down Muskeg, as I have learned from Vern and Lawrence and Sam. So we do these maps to kind of remind us what's going on, because while we think all about the ecological values, our government has opened up these lands to mining. Mining is considered the highest and best end use. And so for us to kind of start to change what happens on the landscape, we have to tackle mining right at the source, and that means knowing about the land claims, or sorry, the mining claims. Ouch. Whoops. For some of you that don't know the Ring of Fire, I got the good spot of this presentation, didn't I, Janet? Thanks for that. Okay. The mining community, the exploration community was there about 14 years ago, and one of them really liked Johnny Cash. So they saw the crescent, and they called it a Ring of Fire. That's where that came from. And then, as you'll see behind me, oh, you haven't seen it yet. Okay, you guys can advance those slides. You're going to start to see what the Ring of Fire looks like when you fly over it. And this is not benign. So as Lorna mentioned, these activities are quite harmful and have been tearing up the peatlands quite under the radar, unless groups like ours and First Nations are drawing attention to it. Exploration in Ontario happens with very little oversight, and I'll get into that in a second. What I do also want to say about the Ring of Fire, and probably a lot of you have heard about it in the media, is that we actually don't know if it's mineable, because no one's produced what they call a technical mining disclosure report demonstrating that it is economically mineable. We're still waiting for that. Now, this hasn't stopped successive premiers, not just Premier Ford, but even the ones before him, from fanning the flames. And most recently, Premier Ford has invoked electric vehicles and critical minerals to support mining here. But without data and full cost carbon accounting, this just sounds like an excuse to me to do more business as usual mining. It's pretty clever to say the green economy needs minerals in the Ring of Fire. But what if the carbon costs are just too high? What if mining here would submarine Canada's entire carbon budget? That seems to me to be what we're figuring out, and we need to figure that out fast. And just to give you a bit of background, in 2012, the justification to mine here was chromite and stainless steel. In 2022, it's electric vehicle batteries. What is it going to be in 2032 or 2042? This region also has no permanent roads, and mining is predicated on access and roads, and building one here would cost about $2 billion. And the mine proponent wants the public to pay for it, just so you know. So these images behind you, we've flown over the Ring of Fire many times. The winter ones are particularly striking because you get to see how much cleared land there is, just due to exploration, early exploration activities. As Lorna mentioned, 500,000 hectares is the claim fabric right now. That's equivalent to 1.2 million acres for my American friends in the room. And what we've learned about exploration over the years, over 14 years actually, because that's how long we've been monitoring it, and a few other colleagues have been monitoring it as well, is that there's a long-lasting footprint of mining claims, trails, drill holes, drill pads, and camps in this carbon-rich ecosystem. They have already impacted the forest and the wetlands. And like I mentioned earlier, the conventional thinking is exploration is benign. It's not benign in the Hudson Bay Lowlands. In fact, I would argue it's de facto deforestation, and it's happening under the radar. What you are getting a bit of a glimpse of are 1,300 drill holes in the Ring of Fire. Diamond drilling requires these big rigs be dragged through the bush, often on haphazardly created and crisscrossing mining roads that compact the soils and permanently degrade the peatlands. You may be a bit surprised to see this, but the only rehabilitation Ontario requires is that drill holes must be capped and materials must be stored more than 30 meters from water bodies. That's it. That's all they're required to do. In fact, when I said to one of the company's executives, like, how come you guys don't go in and, restore the land afterwards? And they were like, well, why would we do that? We're going to build a big mine here anyway. And so they don't have any intention of restoring or rehabilitating the land. And just a little bit to end on the inadequacies of our regulatory system. So these mining trails that you're observing, the line cutting, these winter roads that are being cut through the peatlands, they're all exempt from regulatory review under the Public Lands Act. Exploration activities are not subject to environmental assessment, so blasting, drilling, these line cuttings, the placement of drill pads, no environmental assessment needs to happen before that happens. No carbon accounting. Nobody pays for the carbon losses except for us and the atmosphere. These exploration activities are also exempt from the requirements of Ontario's Endangered Species Act. This is not only are these some of the oldest and deepest peatlands, but this is a really important ecotone, the scientists have been telling us, and really important for wildlife. Activities are permanently exempted from meeting those requirements. And there's no consent required from Indigenous peoples. So we have a very inadequate regulatory system and some challenges here. And the last thing I'll just point to is even Noront, they've been bought out, but in 2020 they did publish a mining disclosure report, and it said that further studies are necessary before determining if resources can be considered mineable, and therefore they may not all be economically recoverable. So we don't even know, and yet we're racing ahead to try and build something that may not even make sense in our future, when we're trying to get a hold on climate. And so I think we've got to do things differently and not just roll up what's happened in the South. So when you take a look at this map and you can see how busy it is, and we can talk about what all that means, but forestry and mining and agriculture and highways, if we don't do something differently, Ontario will just roll this right up, because that's what they do, and that's how the system's designed. They don't want to do something different here. And so I think we can do something different, but we have to want to, and obviously help Indigenous peoples get there too. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna, for taking the difficult, really happy subject for the middle of our presentation. You nailed it, so thanks very much. I'll also say that this is in the context of Canada's recently released critical mineral strategy, which is about trying to meet the need for zero-emission vehicles to solve or help solve the transition to a carbon-neutral, safe climate world. But if you don't count the carbon, and you don't know that it's like 1 billion tons of carbon at risk, I don't see the math really working out. So this is one of the central problems that we have with this, and thanks, Anna, for that explanation of the Ring of Fire. We're now going to move to Mr. Sam Hunter. That's you, Sam.
Hello, this is Sam Hunter. Let's go exploring the Hudson Bay watershed. Let's go.
Yep. Sam, he's I wish you'd have a rifle handy.
I will get it open.
Because
Oh, he's looking scary, eh? When I was young, my dad and I walked here. This is what it looked like. We were out looking for ducks and you could see 1 mile.
oh, there's another one over here.
Where? Right there. There's 2 of them.
Oh my God! I'll tell you what, he could be here pretty fast.
Was that our dirty-ass friend?
No. That one was walking that way.
Fuck, it does not get any better than this.
Stalk us now, eh?
Yeah. I think so.
Gonna follow us home?
Oh!
I got it.
There's another one behind him. They're sneaking up.
I got them all in frame. That's what I said.
Look at him looking around like as if to say, I'm gonna just distract you guys by looking all over the place.
Stalking us now.
Do we have to go?
I don't know. That's how they do when they hunt you. They come really slow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have enough shot?
Of the bear? Yeah, lots.
It's getting too close. It can go really, really fast. I told you that, eh?
Yeah.
I'm gonna shoot now, okay?
Okay.
At that distance, they can get you in a couple of seconds. Too close. Remember that place where Dad and I walked? This is the same spot. Climate change, melting permafrost, sure has changed the landscape. My name is Sam Hunter. I just want to talk about the changes that happened in the last 100 years, maybe 120 years. My great-grandfather, Abraham, his name was, he harvested the first moose. There was no moose in that area. Now there's too many moose up there, moving up north. And we've seen pelican, garter snakes, mountain lion, and other species of birds, doves, mourning doves. And we used to have ponds that used to dot the landscape. Hundreds and thousands of ponds all over the place, but with the melting permafrost, they're all gone. And all of the birds that used to live in those, the phalaropes and many species of ducks, they moved on, probably moved further up north. And we used to have barges that used to come up there. We no longer have barges. There's so much sediment from the landslides, from the river, from the melting permafrost. And you could actually walk the Winds River right across during low tide. It's like 4 miles across, like 6 kilometers. It's so shallow. You can actually walk across. It's only about 2 feet deep. Some places only a foot. There's so much sediment. And there are places where there's trees that are drowning. When the permafrost melts, it turns into a swampland like the Florida Everglades. It just turns into a muskeg. And you can see all these places where there's these dead trees, sometimes as far as the eye can see. My grandfather used to go to his winter camp from Winnisk, and his camp was about 35 miles inland. He would walk on ground solid like this. Now you can't. By the time you get 30 kilometers inland, the rest of it is, it's all muskeg. You can't even walk, it's all water. You're sinking someplace. And during my grandfather's time, my father's time, they would canoe down these rivers, and all they could hear is birds all day. But now you only hear these birds, songbirds, 4:30 in the morning, 5:30 in the evening, that's it. They're all gone. And we think it's from pesticide use, because they have no food. And our shorebirds used to be so abundant. Cities are taking over the beaches, resorts. They have no place to call home. We all need a place to stay, and I think that should be considered. We have so many birds and geese in that area that comes through. There's less and less now. There used to be millions of geese. Now we have a few 100,000. Ducks, their populations have dwindled. And the polar bear, I think they've been adapting quite well. We still have enough geese up there that they feed on geese. They really adapted. I'm told that the average used to be 9 to 1,200. This year I'm told there's 1,600. It's really nice to see, and that something is rebounding through adaptations, and I think we can do that too as human beings. Caribou, the ones we saw in the video, they rebounded. Last time I seen herds like that was when I was 10 years old, about 40 years ago. And Anna put me on the spot 2 weeks before an event in Toronto. She told me to take videos, so I went out and we collected that video, and it was fun. And being born in that area, it's really nice to be in one of the most pristine areas in Canada. I would say it's more isolated than Alaska or the Northwest Territories, where they have roads now. For me, I would want the area to be free of roads. The road they want to make to the Ring of Fire, it's not a road, it's a bridge. I think there's about 60 to 100 creeks and rivers there, bogs. It's basically a bridge. And I think that we need to leave a place in Canada where it's not disturbed so people can see it. And that is very important. It's also a place where we call the lung, carbon. It regenerates. It looks after us. We should look after that. I work with scientists that monitor the pollution in this world. We find that there's pollution from China, India, from the coals. And their pollution circles the world 2.25 times, I believe, from their energy generating stations. And at this point in time, we're still cleaning it. It's not too much pollution. So we have to take care of that place where it cleans the air. And I'm really thankful to be here to share a story. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me. And I really want to have a say and a game to play to protect that area, the marine, Hudson Bay, and also the watershed, the rivers, not to have dams, at least in a couple of rivers up there. Most of the rivers in Canada are dammed, and it really changes the ecosystem. Everything. We've been getting another species of whitefish, and the Quebec Creole telling us that their whitefish, their fish are gone. And the Inuit up north are telling us that their eiders are gone, because a lot of fresh water is going along the coast, going up north, because the water comes from the west to the east and goes back up south to north on the other side. So it's changing, and their livelihood is like turning for the worst. And where we're lucky that there's no industry. And I want to go back in time. A few hundred years ago, when the fur trade started, all of a sudden there was furs showing up in on this river system. And they began to find out they were from our area. And it took the traders to get up there 200 years, because the Mohawks were middlemen. They wouldn't allow the traders to go up there directly. But after 200 years, Hudson Bay Company made it there. They made cams, or places they call forts, one in Moose Factory, one in York Factory. And it's happening all over again with the Ring of Fire. They're finding out there's minerals up there. And there's a lot of graft up there. They really want to do things illegal way, because they try to buy me out too by offering me a camp, boats, and any equipment I wanted, so they can use my camp as a staging area. And they've done that to one of the ex-chiefs up there, because I have pictures to prove it, and it's not right that that place is like a Wild West. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. As you can hear, Sam's very passionate about the place, and thanks for that video. And I'm sorry we gave you such a short time to shoot it. But one of the things that you remarked on in the video was just how fast a polar bear is. I think it's as fast as a cheetah over like 40 meters or something like that. So you can imagine if you're within 100 meters of it, and it can run pretty fast. And Anna says to you, let's get closer. That's not really a good idea, right, Anna? I think that was what we learned on our first trip when we saw polar bears with Sam. Yeah, anyway, so we're going to actually move to some question and answer, and we are also very fortunate, even though Dr. Harris had to leave, we have the Executive Director for WCS Canada here, Dr. Justina Ray. So if you have questions about Lorna's presentation, or you want to know a little bit more about the peatlands and carbon, feel free to ask those questions as well. So maybe I'll just ask, if you do have a question, if you could stand up here or speak into this mic, that would be good. I just got the thumbs up from the audio folks in the back, because this is being live streamed and it would really help. So maybe I'll take some questions if you have any. Anybody? Yep, go ahead, Michael.
Hi, hello. Michael Polanyi from Nature Canada, and we've been doing a fair bit of work, with Janet and others, around carbon emissions associated with logging and use of wood products in the managed forest. So it was quite interesting to hear both Lorna and Anna kind of mentioning that these exploration and mining impacts in the unmanaged forest are also not counted appropriately. And we found that we're getting some leverage in terms of protection around biodiversity by leveraging greater attention to the carbon impacts, given the attention to climate change. And I just was wondering, I mean, this is something it would be great to continue to talk about, but Have you sort of had any discussions with Environment Canada about this problem, this huge gap in the unmanaged forest, just as there are gaps in the managed forest around carbon measurement and reporting?
We may have mentioned it, but Justina, that's a joke. We've actually had several conversations with the federal government, the provincial government, any scientists that will listen to us. But Justina, do you want to take a shot at a bigger answer on that? That'd be great.
Hello, everybody. It's more complicated because there's quite a lot of data gaps, and as Lorna was starting to describe, we've got this huge, vast peatland and just a few areas where there have been carbon cores, and so much more needs to happen on that score, but also to understand sort of the flows, as Vern was also describing, from land to sea, and in terms of how it's being dealt with in policy, the issue is not it is not being counted in exploration, but more we're not yet ready for the decisions, the big decisions around mines, because we don't understand the trade-offs sufficiently. So we have some idea that there's a huge amount at stake, which Lorna did give a good picture of. But in terms of being able to actually manage it, to put in a road in a way that would not compromise that sink in such a fashion as to make the problem worse in some ways, is not yet there. The policy tools are also not strong enough. So we have a few glimmers of hope. So there is a strategic assessment of climate change that gives some direction to projects if they make it to federal impact assessment, and many of these won't be big enough to do so. But again, having the measures is a gap. There's also a plan for regional assessment that would be led by the federal government, but hopefully in partnership with Indigenous communities and Ontario government as well, that should, if it was done properly, actually set the table for important information gathering and decisions about trade-offs, so that you don't leave them to the end after you make the decision, then try to make the impacts less bad than they otherwise would be, which is our general approach. It's mitigation, but really we have to be talking about avoidance of impacts, and that can only happen at the beginning of a process. And so there's some glimmers of things that are there, but that these, especially in the critical minerals situation, has to be much stronger. The last thing I'll say is that in the unveiling of the critical minerals strategy, Minister Wilson was asked specifically about the Ring of Fire, and he acknowledged in his answer, and also in a few places mentioned in the strategy itself, that peatlands are at stake. So it is a good that that is understood. It's just what to do about it, and how to ensure that the right information is at the table to discuss those trade-offs is essential.
Thanks very much, Justina. Any other questions from the audience? Yes. Yeah, please. If you could say your name, that would be helpful as well.
Thank you for the great presentation today. Very informative. My name's Kevin Scott. I'm president of Resolve Canada. We're a sister organization to Resolve, the international charity out of Washington, D.C. And we specialize in a variety of different areas, partnering and allying with First Nations. We have several projects in British Columbia underway right now. One of our fundamental specialties, though, is mining. And we advise mining companies around the world on best practices and where they shouldn't go. And so I'm just curious if there's any need to get into some very high-level CEOs' offices and talk about the true cost of basically what it would be to mine properly in the Ring of Fire. And I think an economic analysis and telling some of the CEOs that we work with the actual cost here would, I think, have a little bit of impact. So we're here, and if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you today. So I'll be just sitting over there.
Okay, great. That's a great offer. Anybody want to follow up with an answer on that? Or Anna, do you want to talk about it?
You mean about whether or not You mean about chatting with mining executives about the risks, or?
No, I just think, well, actually, maybe I'll say what I'm thinking about it rather than teasing something out of you. So in response to your question, I think that understanding the risks that companies would bear, like who's actually going to actually bear the carbon cost, because the carbon, once it becomes a mine, it does become something that's counted. So that would be something that companies would need to know going in with eyes wide open. There are also other challenges in this landscape. For example, this landscape, I think Sam was discussing this, how we've got airborne deposition of mercury, and that mercury is at background levels, and do mining companies want to be responsible for any delta in including or sort of mobilizing and methylating and moving mercury up the food chain. So that would be another piece, and in this region you've got chromium, and if you're going to go in there and mine there, you're going to end up with hexavalent chromium. So that's another risk factor that companies would be bearing. So it wouldn't just be, from my perspective, mining companies, but also the investment community that backs the miners. Because many times these mining projects require huge investments to be able to go forward. And it's something as a risk factor that Canada needs to be thinking about as well, because we need to have everybody who's investing in this. If Canada's thinking about putting $1 billion in a road, they've got to be thinking about what are the risk factors and will they be responsible. And then I think there's also a full disclosure required for the communities who are considering this. Justina mentioned the idea that Canada and Ontario are thinking about a regional environmental assessment. You can't do that if you're not going to put all the risk factors on the table. So I welcome your contribution, and we should definitely have a conversation. I just think that everybody needs to be aware of the risks, all Canadians, et cetera, and certain the First Nations who are bearing the brunt of this and being down muskeg.
I just want to add to that, you know, perhaps you should advise them this is an area that you shouldn't go. You know, and I was at a natural resources forum here in Ontario, in Toronto, a couple of years back, and I asked a panel of experts. Their panel title was "Can the environment and development coexist?" And you know, the leading caption was "Yes, it can." Right. So I asked them. I said, "Can the Ring of Fire in its full-blown, we know how many mining claims there are there and how many potential mines are there. We know that not just Wyloo is there. There's a few others behind them waiting for them to get through there." I said, can that coexist with the third largest wetlands in the world, with the second largest carbon sink in the world? And they all looked at each other and they said, good question, we don't know. You know, and so if we don't know, then, you know, why should we go in there? You know, the Pew Foundation, you know, was quoted in research saying that, you know, if you put a value to what this wetlands, this region does, the value is approximately $700 billion per year in services. You know, so how do you equate that to something that might provide the government $6 billion over 100 years? How do you equate that? You know, and you know, that's a huge ecosystem that does a lot, not only for the region but for the whole world. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're working to try and protect this region and bring attention to it, not only locally but internationally. And we're getting there. Thanks.
Thanks, Vern, for a very direct answer to that question. I think we're almost out of time, but maybe time for one short question if anybody has something burning. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. I'm Jillian. I work with CPAWS Northern Alberta, and I do a lot of caribou conservation work, so I'm so sorry to ask a caribou question. But that was some wonderful footage that you had of the caribou herd. I'm just wondering if...
I'm sorry, can you take your mask off? They're having trouble being able to hear you. Thanks.
I'm just wondering if you can comment on if there's caribou range planning happening here. We know that there's a federal direction on how much habitat needs to be protected for caribou, and if it's being thought of connectivity of the marine protected area with then some terrestrial habitat protection for caribou.
There isn't. I'm sorry to say there isn't. And Ontario stopped monitoring that particular caribou that you saw are Eastern Migratory, and Ontario stopped monitoring them quite some time ago. And so partly what we're trying to do is see if they can restart the monitoring, because we didn't get a chance to talk a bit about it, but those caribou use the boreal forest and the lowland and the coast, and so they're using that entire ecosystem, and they go into Manitoba as well. So it would be really valuable for them to restart the monitoring here and help us have some data on that that important question.
And I can't let a caribou question go without asking the guru on caribou, Dr. Justina Ray.
Sorry. That herd that you saw, which is not the boreal caribou, it's in a different ecotype entirely. And what's very interesting about it is that it's tied to George River and Leaf River herds in Quebec, which have been plunging in numbers, and so it was actually classified as endangered. But that is not official. They're going through a consultation, and right now it's just special concern in Ontario. There is no recovery strategy for it yet. There is no critical habitat protection like for boreal caribou. But in the Ring of Fire proper, definitely, like that's where monitoring has to stand up, where they have to do range planning, because that's the geographic range of both boreal and these eastern migratory caribou. Eastern migratory caribou come into the same range in winter, especially along that ecotone between the Hudson Bay Lowlands and the lowland boreal forest is absolutely critical for caribou. Both ecotypes, they go back and forth, up and down in that area, really essential for biodiversity protection. So caribou will need a lot of attention with the Ring of Fire development.
Thanks, Justina, as I said, the guru. So thank you, everybody, for attending, coming to our presentation. Thank you, Anna, Sam, Byrne, Carrie, and Marshall, and Lorna, who had to dash literally across campus to get to the other presentation. And thanks to all of you from Canada for making this space available and providing such good care. Appreciate it.